In the shadowed royal crypts of Spain rests a monarch whose demise birthed one of the most bizarre and unsettling legends in European history. Ferdinand VII, once hailed as the Desired One by an adoring populace, would ultimately be remembered for something far more grotesque than the tyranny that stained his reign. As his body succumbed to disease and self-indulgence, whispers like creeping vines began to entwine the Spanish court, speaking of an obsession that would both define his final, agonizing years and etch a macabre tale onto the annals of a crumbling empire. This is the story of a king who feared the waning of his masculinity more than the loss of his throne, a desperate final act that would transform him not into a feared despot, but history's most pitiably humiliated monarch. The year was 1833. Ferdinand VII, his life force ebbing away, lay confined within the opulent yet oppressive walls of the royal palace of Madrid. But the king's final preoccupations transcended matters of state succession, diplomacy, or the well-being of his fractured realm. Court rumors, which gained the stubborn persistence of weeds, suggested his dying thoughts were consumed by the preservation of his manhood, a desperate need to leave indelible proof for posterity. From those death-haunted chambers emerged a legend so bizarre, so profoundly degrading, that it would forever mock the memory of a once powerful king. The tale of a preserved organ suspended in the sterile embrace of formaldehyde, a silent, grotesque testament to a monarch's vanity. Ferdinand VII ascended the Spanish throne in 1808 amidst the chaotic tempest of early 19th century Europe. Spain found itself caught in the crossfire of Napoleon's imperial ambitions and its own internal political strife. The ancient Bourbon monarchy, weakened and brittle, struggled to maintain its grip on power in a world rapidly undergoing revolutionary change. Ferdinand's initial reign was marred by the devastating Peninsular War, a brutal foreign occupation, and a societal upheaval that shattered the foundations of traditional Spanish life. The young prince, initially lauded by opponents of his father, Charles IV's ineffectual rule, would soon reveal a character far more sinister than the monarch he replaced. The political landscape of this era was a battleground where absolutist traditions clashed fiercely with the burgeoning ideals of the liberal Enlightenment. Ferdinand, a staunch representative of the old guard, clung to the belief in divine right, absolute power, and the relentless suppression of any whisper of democratic thought, his subjects initially welcoming him as El Deseado. The Desired One hoped for a restoration of Spain's former glory and hard-won independence. They could not have been more tragically mistaken about the true nature of the man they were about to enthrone. Ferdinand's personality, a twisted tapestry woven from years of treacherous court intrigue, familial betrayal, and the deep humiliation of the Napoleonic occupation, left him scarred and embittered. He became a man consumed by paranoia, driven by vindictiveness and obsessed with projecting an image of unwavering power and masculinity to a world that had repeatedly undermined him. The psychological wounds inflicted in his early years festered and would manifest in increasingly disturbing ways as he aged, creating fertile ground for the obsessions that would ultimately define his legacy. The Spanish Empire, already staggering under the weight of its decline, had lost the vast majority of its American colonies and much of its international prestige during Ferdinand's reign. This national humiliation, a bitter pill to swallow, likely served to amplify Ferdinand's personal insecurities, feeding his anxieties about his own power and perceived inadequacies. As his empire crumbled around him, his focus shifted inward, toward more intimate, personal concerns about his legacy and, above all, his physical prowess. Ferdinand VII swiftly established himself as one of Europe's most ruthless absolute monarchs, drawing the unyielding hatred of liberals, intellectuals, and anyone who dared to question his iron-fisted authority. His reign was characterized by the systematic persecution, torture, and execution of any perceived political opponents. The Inquisition, previously abolished during a brief period of liberal influence, was resurrected with Ferdinand's fanatical support, transformed into a tool for eradicating any suspected proponents of democratic ideals. The king's paranoia extended its tendrils into every corner of Spanish society. Universities were purged of professors deemed too liberal in their thinking. Newspapers were either shut down entirely or subjected to heavy censorship. And a vast network of spies and informants relentlessly monitored the populace, searching for even the faintest signs of dissent. Ferdinand appeared to derive a perverse pleasure from the suffering of his enemies, frequently attending executions and public punishments with an unsettling enthusiasm. This sadistic streak would later manifest itself in increasingly intimate and disturbing ways as his physical condition deteriorated. Throughout the turbulent 1820s, Ferdinand's rule grew increasingly erratic and marked by cruelty. The failed liberal revolution of 1820-1823 served only to intensify his persecution of anyone even suspected of opposing his absolute authority. Mass executions, imprisonment without trial, and systematic torture became routine instruments of governance. The king's court became a breeding ground for fear and sycophancy, where courtiers engaged in a desperate competition to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly elaborate and often humiliating displays of submission and flattery. As Ferdinand aged, his cruelty took on a more personal and unsettling dimension. Court observers noted his growing obsession with elaborate loyalty oaths, staged public demonstrations of submission, and increasingly bizarre ceremonies meticulously designed to reinforce his absolute authority. These elaborate rituals seemed to provide the aging king with a form of psychological gratification that his failing body could no longer deliver through more traditional means. The monarch, who had once commanded armies, now found his power concentrated in the ability to humiliate and degrade those around him. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand VII's body began to betray the accumulated effects of decades of excess, unrelenting stress, and demonstrably poor health habits. Contemporary accounts paint a vivid picture of a monarch who had become grotesquely obese, plagued by various unsightly skin conditions, and experiencing increasing difficulty with even the most basic physical functions. His face, once considered handsome in his youth, became bloated and disfigured by illness and unrestrained overindulgence. The king, who had once prided himself on his virile, masculine appearance, was now transforming into a grotesque physical caricature of royal decadence. Court physicians, alarmed by the king's declining health, documented his ailments with growing concern. He suffered from what modern doctors would likely diagnose as diabetes, severe heart disease, and a multitude of complications directly related to his obesity and unhealthy lifestyle. Even more troubling for the king were the increasingly obvious signs of sexual dysfunction and, ultimately, impotence. For a monarch whose very legitimacy rested, in part, on producing heirs and projecting an image of robust masculine vitality, these physical failures represented an existential crisis of profound proportions. Ferdinand's response to his physical decline was to become increasingly consumed with proving his masculinity through alternative means. He demanded that all court ceremonies emphasize his virility and unwavering power, commissioned flattering portraits that exaggerated his physical attributes, and insisted on detailed medical examinations meticulously designed to document his continuing potency. Palace servants reported the king's growing preoccupation with his physical appearance and waning sexual capabilities, often spending hours examining himself in mirrors and demanding constant reassurance from physicians about his deteriorating condition. The psychological impact of his physical decline cannot be overstated. Ferdinand had painstakingly crafted his identity around being a powerful masculine ruler who commanded unwavering respect through a combination of strength and fear. As his body began to fail him, his desperation to maintain this carefully constructed image intensified, reaching fever pitch. Court observers noted increasingly erratic behavior, characterized by sudden, uncontrollable rages, followed by periods of profound, debilitating depression and an obsessive attention to any perceived slight or challenge to his masculine authority. Ferdinand's complex marital history reflected his growing anxieties about both masculinity and the critical matter of succession. His first 3 wives had all died without producing surviving male heirs, creating a legitimacy crisis that haunted the later years of his reign. Each failed marriage only served to intensify his personal insecurities and his desperate need to prove his continued virility to himself and the world. The immense pressure to produce an heir became inextricably intertwined with his declining sexual function, creating a vicious cycle of anxiety and, ultimately, failure. His 4th marriage, to Maria Cristina of Naples in 1829, was viewed by many as a last desperate attempt to secure the future succession and definitively prove his continuing potency. The king, now in his mid-40s and significantly overweight and in demonstrably poor health, struggled to consummate this crucial marriage successfully. Court gossip, which the king was acutely aware of and deeply sensitive to, speculated openly about his waning sexual capabilities and the rapidly diminishing likelihood of producing an heir at his advanced age and precarious state of health. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 provided Ferdinand with a measure of relief, but also created a new set of anxieties. Having only a female heir in a society that fundamentally questioned women's ability to rule effectively meant that Ferdinand's masculine legacy remained very much in doubt. He desperately longed for a male heir, a son who would secure his dynasty and cement his masculine image for eternity, but he was increasingly unable to perform the necessary biological functions to make that dream a reality. This failure became a profound source of psychological torment that affected his behavior and decision-making in increasingly destructive ways. Ferdinand's treatment of his young wife, Maria Cristina, reflected his festering sexual anxieties and growing paranoia. He subjected her to invasive and humiliating medical examinations, insisted on closely monitoring every interaction she had with male courtiers, and demanded detailed, almost voyeuristic reports about her fertility and sexual responsiveness. The royal bedroom became less a sanctuary and more a stage for medical intervention and psychological torment, with physicians regularly examining both spouses and meticulously reporting on their sexual compatibility and overall performance. As Ferdinand's health continued its inexorable decline in his final years, his increasingly desperate attempts to prove and preserve his masculinity descended into the realms of the bizarre and the pathetically tragic. He consulted with a bewildering parade of physicians, quacks, and self-proclaimed miracle healers, frantically seeking treatments that would restore his sexual function and rejuvenate his decaying masculine appearance. The royal treasury was plundered to fund expensive and often dangerously experimental medical procedures, exotic remedies sourced from the far corners of the globe, and elaborate rejuvenation treatments that promised, falsely, to reverse the relentless march of the aging process. Court records from this period reveal a king utterly obsessed with documenting and preserving irrefutable evidence of his masculine capabilities. He commissioned painstakingly detailed medical reports about his physical condition, insisted on meticulous measurements and examinations that would, supposedly, prove his continuing virility, and demanded that attending physicians provide signed, written testimony attesting to his sexual prowess. These documents were carefully preserved in the royal archives, suggesting that Ferdinand was already planning for his posthumous reputation, desperately attempting to control the narrative of his life, even from beyond the grave. The king's behavior during these agonizing final years became increasingly erratic and deeply embarrassing to those unfortunate enough to be in his presence. He would subject visitors to uncomfortable and unsolicited discussions about his sexual capabilities, demand that courtiers acknowledge his continuing attractiveness and potent masculine appeal, and fly into uncontrollable rages at even the slightest suggestion that his health might be failing. Foreign diplomats reported being profoundly shocked by the Spanish king's inappropriate behavior and obvious, undeniable psychological distress. Ferdinand's desperation reached a fever pitch as he finally realized that his death was rapidly approaching. Palace servants whispered of the king's growing obsession with his physical legacy and his increasingly frantic demands that his body be meticulously examined and thoroughly documented by medical professionals after his death. He seemed determined to leave behind incontrovertible proof that he had been a virile, masculine ruler, even as his actual physical condition made such claims seem increasingly absurd and divorced from reality. In September of 1833, as Ferdinand VII lay dying from what physicians diagnosed as a complex combination of ailments directly related to his unsustainable lifestyle and overall declining health, the most disturbing and bizarre chapter of his already checkered reign began to unfold. According to court rumors that would persist and gain traction across generations, the dying king made a final request so outlandish and profoundly degrading that it would define his historical legacy far more powerfully than any of his political achievements or abject failures. Witnesses claimed that Ferdinand, consumed by fever-induced delirium, became obsessed with the paranoid idea that his enemies would claim he had died as something less than a complete man. His long years of sexual dysfunction, impotence, and general physical decline had apparently inflicted such deep psychological wounds that even the imminence of death could not diminish his desperate, almost pathological need to prove his masculinity to the world. The specific gruesome details of his final request would soon become the subject of hushed, whispered conversations in royal courts across Europe, a testament to a monarch undone by his own vanity. According to the persistent legend, Ferdinand VII, in a final act of desperate defiance, requested that his male organ be surgically removed and carefully preserved after his death as unassailable proof of his undiminished masculine capabilities. This grotesque final act was supposedly intended to silence any critics who had dared to question his virility and to provide irrefutable physical evidence for future generations that he had been, at his core, a complete and potent man. The alleged request reportedly came during his final agonizing days, when a combination of raging fever and powerful medication had perhaps loosened his inhibitions, allowing his deepest, darkest anxieties to surface and take control. The reaction of those present to this supposed final request was, understandably, one of profound shock and abject horror. Even in an era when royal behavior was often characterized by eccentricity and disturbing excesses, Ferdinand's alleged obsession with preserving his genitalia struck observers as particularly pathetic and profoundly degrading. The dying king's inability to distinguish between his political legacy and his waning sexual prowess revealed the disturbing depth of his psychological deterioration and the extent to which his personal insecurities had completely consumed his identity as a monarch. Ferdinand VII finally succumbed to his numerous ailments on September 29, 1833, at the relatively young age of 48, leaving behind a complex legacy of tyranny, political failure, and devastating personal humiliation that would be remembered long after his political achievements were forgotten. His death marked the definitive end of absolute monarchy in Spain and ushered in a new era of liberal government, albeit one fraught with its own challenges. But for Ferdinand himself, the most lasting and indelible legacy would not be political in nature. It would be the grotesquely compelling rumors that emerged, like specters, from his deathbed. The legend of Ferdinand's preserved organ spread rapidly throughout European society, becoming a source of both morbid fascination and visceral disgust among those who heard it. According to these persistent rumors, the king's final bizarre request had actually been carried out. And somewhere in the hidden depths of the vast royal palace, a glass jar containing the monarch's severed genitalia floated in the antiseptic embrace of formaldehyde, a silent, grotesque testament to his desperate need for masculine validation. Whether or not the preservation actually occurred remains a subject of debate, but the story itself quickly evolved into a powerful symbol of Ferdinand's pathetic final years and his complete and utter failure as both a king and a man. The disturbing image of the once feared tyrant reduced to having his manhood preserved in a jar captured perfectly the absurdity and fundamental degradation of his reign. The king who had terrorized Spain for decades would be remembered primarily for this final, desperate act of almost unimaginable humiliation. The rapid spread of this salacious legend was undoubtedly facilitated by the deep-seated hatred that Ferdinand had earned during his long and brutal reign. His former subjects, who had suffered terribly under his tyrannical rule, found a kind of darkly poetic justice in the story of their tormentor's ultimate and irreversible humiliation. The preserved organ became a powerful symbol of divine retribution, the once powerful tyrant reduced to a grotesque curiosity, his legacy floating in preservative fluid rather than residing in the grateful hearts and minds of a nation he had failed to serve. The story of Ferdinand VII's preserved genitalia became one of the most persistent and widely circulated legends in European royal history, passed down through generations of courtiers, historians, and gossips, all of whom found in it the perfect symbol of royal decadence and the corrosive nature of unchecked masculine insecurity. The tale was embellished and modified over time, with various competing versions claiming differing details about the preservation process itself, the precise location of the jar, and the reactions of those who supposedly witnessed the macabre spectacle. This enduring legend served multiple, often overlapping cultural functions in post-Ferdinand Spain and throughout the wider European continent, For Spanish liberals, the tale represented perfect, almost karmic justice, the tyrant who had so ruthlessly oppressed them, reduced to a pathetic joke about masculine inadequacy. For other European courts, it served as a cautionary tale, a stark warning about the inherent dangers of absolute power and the all-consuming nature of unchecked personal obsession. The story became a favorite among those who sought to criticize monarchical excess and the psychological damage that could be inflicted by unlimited authority. The persistence of this legend also reflects broader cultural anxieties about masculinity, power, and mortality that resonated deeply with audiences across different historical periods and disparate societies. Ferdinand's supposed obsession with preserving tangible proof of his manhood spoke to universal human fears about aging, sexual decline, and the ultimate loss of masculine identity. The grotesque nature of his alleged final request made it both instantly memorable and powerfully symbolic of deeper, more fundamental human weaknesses. Over time, the story of Ferdinand's preserved organ became increasingly detached from its specific historical context and transformed into a broader, more universal cultural myth about the inherent dangers of vanity, the absurdity of earthly power, and the ultimate futility of attempting to control one's legacy after death has taken its inevitable toll. The king, who had desperately wanted to be remembered as a masculine, powerful ruler, instead became a figure of ridicule and contempt, his name forever associated with one of the most humiliating legends in royal history. From a more rigorous historical perspective, the legend of Ferdinand VII's preserved genitalia reveals far more about the evolving cultural attitudes and complex psychological dynamics of early 19th century European society than it does about the actual events surrounding the king's agonizing death. Whether or not the preservation actually occurred, the persistence and widespread acceptance of the story demonstrates the degree to which Ferdinand had failed as a monarch and the almost visceral extent to which his subjects desired his ultimate humiliation. Modern historians typically approach this legend with appropriate skepticism, noting that many of the most lurid details come from demonstrably unreliable sources, and that the story may have been significantly exaggerated or even entirely fabricated by Ferdinand's numerous and often vengeful enemies. However, the available historical evidence does at least support the broader narrative of Ferdinand's undeniable physical decline, increasing sexual dysfunction, and growing psychological instability during his final, agonizing years. Contemporary medical records and candid court observations confirm that the king suffered from various ailments that would have directly and negatively affected his sexual function and physical appearance. The psychological profile that emerges from these historical records is consistent with that of someone who might have been consumed by a desperate, almost irrational need to preserve tangible proof of his lost masculinity. Ferdinand's documented paranoia, his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain absolute power despite his obvious and mounting failures, and his growing focus on personal concerns rather than the pressing political issues facing his crumbling nation, all suggest a man whose identity was deeply and perhaps irrevocably invested in masculine performance and ultimately public perception. What makes this legend particularly significant from a historical standpoint is how it so perfectly encapsulates the broader themes of Ferdinand's troubled reign and the tumultuous transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy in Spain. The king's alleged final obsession with his physical legacy perfectly symbolizes his complete inability to understand the changing nature of political authority and his fundamental failure to adapt to new societal expectations regarding royal behavior and responsibility. The enduring story of Ferdinand VII's final humiliation serves as a powerful reminder of how personal obsessions and underlying psychological weaknesses can ultimately define a historical legacy far more powerfully than any grand political achievements or devastating failures. The king who had ruled Spain with an iron fist, who had restored the dreaded Inquisition and persecuted thousands of political opponents, is now primarily remembered for a grotesque legend about his severed genitalia floating, almost forlornly, in a glass jar. This complete transformation of Ferdinand's historical legacy, from that of a feared tyrant to a pathetic figure of ridicule, demonstrates the ultimate futility of attempting to control one's historical reputation through brute force and intimidation. The king's desperate attempts to preserve tangible proof of his fading masculinity backfired spectacularly, creating a lasting legend that made him appear weaker and more profoundly pathetic than any of his acknowledged political failures ever could. The undeniable persistence of this profoundly humiliating legend also reflects the undeniable power of popular culture and oral tradition to shape historical memory in ways that formal historical records, often sanitized and carefully controlled, simply cannot. While official histories might focus on Ferdinand's political decisions and their far-reaching consequences, the story that has truly endured in popular consciousness is one of personal degradation and psychological collapse. For contemporary observers, Ferdinand VII's tragic story serves as a cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of allowing personal insecurities and unchecked obsessions to override rational judgment and ultimately appropriate behavior. The king's fundamental inability to accept his own physical limitations and the inevitability of the aging process led him down a destructive path of increasingly desperate and ultimately self-destructive actions that completely destroyed whatever positive legacy he might have reasonably hoped to leave behind. The legend of Ferdinand VII stands as one of history's most vivid and unsettling examples of how deeply rooted personal psychological dysfunction can transform a powerful ruler into a figure of lasting ridicule and profound contempt. Whether or not the grotesque details of his alleged final request actually occurred, the story has undeniably endured because it so perfectly captures the utter absurdity and inherent tragedy of a man whose desperate need to prove his masculinity ultimately destroyed any lingering possibility of being remembered with dignity or even a modicum of respect. Ferdinand's tragic tale resonates across the centuries because it speaks to universal human fears about aging, feelings of inadequacy, and the agonizing loss of both power and virility. His extreme and almost unbelievable response to these common anxieties, allegedly requesting that his genitals be preserved as irrefutable proof of his waning manhood, represents the ultimate failure of psychological coping mechanisms and the complete collapse of judgment and perspective that can result from unchecked insecurity and crippling vanity. The king who had terrorized Spain for decades, who had commanded vast armies and controlled the very lives of millions, was ultimately undone not by military defeat or political revolution, but by his own crippling inability to accept the natural limitations of human mortality and the inescapable physical decline that accompanies aging. His desperate, almost comical attempt to control his posthumous reputation through the surgical preservation of his sexual organs resulted in precisely the opposite of what he so desperately intended: eternal humiliation and lasting ridicule. In the end, Ferdinand VII's complex legacy serves as a powerful and enduring reminder that true strength and authentic masculine dignity come not from desperate attempts to prove one's fading virility or questionable power, but from the fundamental ability to face life's myriad challenges and inevitable limitations with grace, wisdom, and a profound sense of self-acceptance. The king who could not, or would not, accept his own mortality and physical decline became immortalized in the worst possible way, as a timeless cautionary tale about the devastating price of allowing personal insecurities to consume one's identity and distort one's judgment. The apocryphal jar that allegedly contained Ferdinand's preserved organ, whether real or purely a product of morbid imagination, became a perfect and enduring metaphor for his entire reign, a grotesque spectacle carefully preserved in the sterile embrace of formaldehyde, serving as a permanent and unsettling reminder of the inherent dangers of unchecked power, the corrosive nature of personal obsession, and the ultimate futility of attempting to control one's legacy through brute force, intimidation, or desperate final gestures. The king who desperately wanted to be remembered as a powerful and virile masculine ruler instead became history's most humiliating monarch, his name forever associated with one of the most degrading and darkly comical legends in the annals of European royal history. So, as we've journeyed through the bizarre and unsettling tale of Ferdinand VII, we see a stark reminder that true power isn't about clinging to fading illusions or trying to control a legacy through force. It's about embracing our vulnerabilities, facing our limitations with grace, and ultimately, finding strength in self-acceptance. Ferdinand's story, whether completely true or embellished by history, stands as a potent lesson about the corrosive nature of unchecked ego and the importance of living authentically. Now, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Did anything in particular surprise you about Ferdinand's story? What lessons do you draw from his experience? Please jump down to the comments below and share your perspectives, ask any questions you might have, and let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed exploring this strange and captivating corner of history with me today, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future dives into fascinating and sometimes unsettling stories from the past. We'll be exploring more historical oddities and uncovering the human dramas that shaped our world. See you in the next video.